these problems would have been worked out, and there would be none of the animosity that you still see being milked today. It has degenerated into a racket, what many people have called the victimization racket, Mary, where it's such a lucrative racket, they are not going to give it up until they are forced to. You are not going to get these race hustlers like Jesse Jackson, for example, and the man with the hair. I can't remember his name now. Al Sharpton, the man with the hair. This is a guy who should be in prison many times over for concocting that phony rape situation, for example, the Tawana Brawley situation.
Exactly.
And that's not the only one. And they still are accorded the deference, all the deference from the media, from the mass media, the so-called mainstream media in our country. So all of these things are the dangerous, the devastating effects of this type of legislation, and we haven't seen the end of it yet, unfortunately.
Well, isn't it true that the 1954 Supreme Court ruling, I think it was Brown versus the Board of Education,
yes,
it set the precedent for the civil rights movement, right?
It did in schools. And there you have another interesting aspect of this. The Supreme Court bases its entire decision on a book called An American Dilemma. What's an American Dilemma? Well, this is a sociological study by a guy named Gunnar Myrdal. Who's Gunnar Myrdal? Gunnar Myrdal is a Swede. He's a Swede who has come to the United States. He's written a book called An American Dilemma about this situation. The Supreme Court goes to him as an expert. Why did they go to him as the ultimate authority? He's a communist. And so, yes.
This is documented?
Oh, yes. Gunnar Myrdal, look it up. Myrdal. He's deeply involved in the Red Movement. And so the Supreme Court goes to him as an authority and decides this case not on the basis of American law, not on the basis of the Constitution, but on the basis of what this guy is telling us, this foreign red is telling us we need to do in our country. Look it up, read Brown versus Board of Education, 1954.
And isn't it also true that this ruling didn't equally apply to all school districts in the United States? It just applied to certain school districts, right?
As I recall, it applied to certain school districts, yes, and it was used as the basis for this turmoil that we've been talking about, the forced school busing, the control of the local school systems by the federal judges. Isn't
it also true that there were many, many black Americans who did not support this?
Of course there were, just as there are today many black Americans.
They didn't want their little children.
Well, of course not. Remember, one of the basic arguments here, Mary, is that the Brown decision and this school busing basically were very insulting to black people, because the idea was you cannot get a good education if you're black. You cannot succeed if you're black unless your black child, is sitting next to a white child.
It's ridiculous.
Well, I mean, isn't that
but
very
that's fundamentally,
insulting?
you're
That's
right.
basically what they were telling us.
That's what it boils down to.
You have to put your kids in, because they were spending as much money on the black schools. You couldn't say, well, they weren't spending any money on the black schools. They were spending on the white schools. No, they had the finances were not a problem. It was the fact that the black kids had to sit next to the white kids. Then they would get a better education. Well, that seems to me to be tremendously insulting.
Okay, well,
meaning, and it would have a definite psychological effect on the young people who were subjected to it.
Absolutely, and let's be honest about this. It was 50 years of this government enforced on integrating schools. What we have now? Well, the Asians are number one in their academic performance, followed by whites, followed by Hispanics and the blacks.
Well, so an apostle of Gandhi's
work, and that's why the Supreme Court has made
violence.
Forget it. We're not going to impose this.
Again, I said a moment ago who are saying another aspect of this, Mary, of Gandhi's, black men can solve this. Look, you go into the Asian community. One of the most important things in the Asian community is education. They sacrifice everything. It's education. Send your kids to school. This
right.
And the result is, it's very simple. Electronic engineers, mechanical engineers, doctors, and so on, the result of that, adulation for education. Well, what do you find in so many black communities? They reject education. You've got a very intelligent black young person who wants to get an education. They attack him, they demean him or her, and they say, you're acting white. Well, how? You're acting white. Well, so the result of this is you have many, many, many black young people who could benefit from an education who don't get it because of the terrible mental pressure in their neighborhoods. Now, again, white people cannot solve a problem like this. Only strong black men, strong black Christian men can solve this problem. And it's not going to be solved until those men solve it.
And all government done, as I can see, is made. I mean, let's look at public housing, which is a direct result of this. We have to have equality of living standards. So we have Section 8.
Sympathies.
What do we see coming out of that?
Sympathy with the
crime, drugs,
prostitution,
hopelessness for those young black Americans that are locked into that.
So bad that in some cities, haven't they had to dynamite and raise these projects? They got so bad they had to raise the projects. The people do not respect their own places where they live because they haven't been taught to do that. And you know,
because they don't own it.
They don't own it. They don't own it. And look, here's another point I made recently in one of my magazine articles. They engineer these communist riots. All right, so now you've got a huge riot in one of these neighborhoods. The black people, or at least maybe the terrorists, the secret communists who are victimizing the black neighborhoods, burn down their own neighborhoods. Then they complain we have no facilities. Have you ever heard of anybody doing this? Any other community on earth? Any type of people, race, color, ethnic background, any country? They burn down their own. I mean, you could understand, you wouldn't approve maybe, but you could understand if they went somewhere else and they burned down somebody else's place. Well, these people are victimizing us and they're stealing from us, so we're going and we're burning down their neighborhood. But you burn down your own neighborhood? And that's why, another reason why, you go through so many black neighborhoods for many years, this has been true. There are no stores, there are no services. Why? They're not being denied these services, they destroyed them. Well, these are some of the examples of these. This is the fallout from this horrific communist program imposed upon us by the federal government, the primary victims of which have been black. And by the way, I want to
Alan, nobody knows this. If you're under 50, you have even heard that the communists were involved in the civil rights movement.
Yes.
And that they were behind the scenes in the civil rights legislation. They don't know that. I mean, this is a whole new world for many people to hear this.
I wanted to make a point, Mary. Some years back, I was invited by some businessmen to go to New Zealand. Now, they were having a national election in New Zealand. And they wanted me to come in, these businessmen, they brought me there to talk about the New World Order. Now, obviously, I wasn't going to talk about the election. I didn't even know who the candidates were, but the idea was that I would talk in general about the New World Order, and they would apply that to the election because that was a very important issue. When I got there, I discovered a very interesting phenomenon. You had there a phenomenon called the welfare mum. The welfare mum, they called it. These are girls who have found out that if they get pregnant, the government will pay for everything. Puts them in an apartment, pays their expenses, everything. Well, hey, this is a heck of a deal. Let's get pregnant.
Right.
Well, now, are there any black people involved? No, there are no black people in the country. This is New Zealand. The closest you can get is there are people there called the Maori. These are Polynesian, native Polynesian people. But there are no black people.